In October 2020, the Department for Education released some new non-statutory guidance titled Keeping Children Safe During Community Activities, After-School Clubs and Tuition that is aimed as a non-statutory piece of guidance for providers running out-of-school settings. In this episode of Safeguarding Days, we're going to work through the document and its different sections to support our own understanding around the expectations placed on out-of-school settings to safeguard children, and to also increase our own understanding around some of the risks and safety protective factors that should be in place to help parents identify safe settings for their own children and young people outside of school hours. So broadly, this is a non-statutory guidance from the Department for Education, and it aims to help providers in out-of-school settings understand best practice for creating a safe environment for children in their care, and give parents and carers confidence that their child is in a safe activity or learning environment. I'm going to narrate this episode by sticking as close as I can to the exact wording of the guidance, but also offer some analysis in the sense of the person offering advice directly to a provider. So this document opens by reminding us of that definition of safeguard, and it's the same definition that we see in Keeping Children Safe in Education, and that is that safeguarding and promoting the welfare of children is everyone's responsibility. Safeguarding is defined for the purpose of the guidance in the same way it is for keeping children safe, and that's to protect children from maltreatment, prevent the impairment of children's mental health and physical health or development, and ensuring that children grow up in circumstances consistent with the provision of safe and effective care, and taking action, of course, if you identify children who may be at risk. So as I say, this guidance is for organisations or individuals who provide those community activities, tuition or after-school clubs for children. Following this guidance is voluntary for settings, aside from obviously the legal requirements, which we kind of make clear throughout this episode, but is also really clear in the guidance. The DfE are really clear that they're not going to monitor or assess whether providers are implementing these practices set out. However, they are clear in saying that by adopting these practices, you will be taking reasonable steps to ensure the safety of children using your services and attending those settings. So the guidance has been developed in consultation with representatives from organisations linked to out-of-school settings, which includes a range of kind of people from different faith backgrounds, from different organisations representing youth and sports clubs. They've also spoken to schools, local authority, Ofsted and so on, and it's by pulling all those views together that they've formed this guidance. What they've said is this guidance covers community activities, after-school clubs, supplementary schools, tuition, music lessons and sports training, but they've been really clear to make explicit in this document that the guidance doesn't account for community activities, schools, colleges, 16 to 19 college, providers of care for children under 8, registered with Ofsted or a childminder, etc. So what are out-of-school settings? Well, OOSS, as they're referred to in the guidance, are organisations or individuals that provide tuition, training, instructions or activities to children in England without their parent or carer's supervisions, but they're not schools, colleges or alternative providers, for example. These settings generally provide tuition, training, instruction or activities outside of the normal school hours. Although some settings are run part-time during school hours to help meet the needs of those in home education, OOSS should not, however, be operating full-time and would probably be regarded as operating illegally if it also met the requirements for registration as an independent school. In such cases, the provider would risk a criminal prosecution for operating an unregistered school, so there's a clear distinction there. These settings can occur in many kinds of venues, from a person's home to much larger and more formal places such as community centres, youth centres, sports clubs and places of worship. And this document's clear that it's irrelevant whether fees are charged or not. The document reminds providers that they have a duty of care towards the children who attend, and this means that by law they must take reasonable steps to ensure the safety of children and to protect them from harm. As detailed in the DfE's statutory guidance Working Together to Safeguard Children, it says that no single practitioner can have a full picture of a child's needs and circumstances. So everyone who comes into contact with them has a role to play in identifying concerns, sharing information and taking prompt action. This document really recognises the characteristics of settings can vary, including the activity and the learning they offer. So the steps you take to reduce the risk of harm to children in your setting will differ depending on its specific characteristics. For example, the size, type of activity, tuition being offered, location, hours, and so on. However, it is clear that taking appropriate steps to reduce risk will reassure parents that their children will be safe in your care. All settings, without exception, should also refer to the DfE's current guidance on protective measures for holiday and after-school clubs. This is national guidance to support providers and advise on practical steps you can take to minimise the risk to children, staff and parents who attend your setting by reducing the risk of infection and transmission of the coronavirus COVID-19. So in the document, it talks about 4 key areas or key basic requirements that these out-of-school settings need to consider. And they are health and safety, safeguard and child protection, suitability of staff and volunteers, and governance. And what we're going to do is work through each section to identify what's required, what documents should be consulted, and offer some advice as to the type of questions you may expect in each area from parents. So starting with health and safety, providers must consider the suitability and safety of the setting for employees and should take reasonable steps to reduce any risks identified. Now this can include a range of things such as ensuring staff have first aid training and or access to a first aid kit, and awareness of what to do in an emergency. They must have a fire safety and evacuation plan, and for the setting they should have more than one emergency contact number for each child where reasonably possible, and know of any medical conditions, concerns or allergies. In terms of child protection, they must have a safeguarding child protection policy in place, including procedures for dealing with safeguarding incidents. This should be communicated with all staff. They should have an awareness of training and the specific safeguarding issues that can put children at risk of harm, for example, the categories of abuse. They should ensure that staff have clear procedures on what to do if they have a concern about staff, members, volunteers, or any other adult who may pose a risk of harm to children. They should appoint a designated safeguarding leader, DSL, who has undertaken suitable safeguarding and child protection training. They should provide parents with a named individual, such as the DSL, so they can raise safeguarding concerns. And also they should have contact details for the DSL and the local authority's designated officer and know the local referral route into children's social care. In the section about suitability of staff and volunteers, which very much piggybacks on the safeguard and child protection section, it reminds us that we should ensure that staff and volunteers have had relevant pre-employment checks such as DBS and verification of identity. There should be regular performance reviews in place to check the suitability and training requirements of staff and volunteers after their employment. In terms of governance, there should be a clear complaints procedure and there should have an effective whistleblowing policy. And there's a range of stuff in there as well around expectations in a business sense. So let's start by turning to the page in the guidance where it talks a little bit more about health and safety. Now, it's important to remember that the practices you put in place should be regularly reviewed to ensure the children in your setting are safe. For example, if you change venue, you should carry out a new risk assessment and ensure that all staff are aware of what steps to take to reduce any risks identified. Providers should ensure that they have a written health and safety policy, including a risk assessment section, an appointed person or at least one member of staff who has first aid training, a fire and safety evacuation plan, and have trained all members of staff on health and safety and created a GDPR compliant registration form for the children in their care. This form should include essential contact information, medical details, and that register should be taken at the start of each session. So looking in more detail at duty of care. As a provider, you are likely to have a legal duty of care to try and ensure the environment is safe for people who visit or attend. This means you've got a legal duty to take reasonable steps to ensure that people will be safe using the venue for the purposes for which they attend. The propertier is responsible for health and safety regardless of the setting, whether it is a classroom, a sports pitch, tuition centre, or your own home. It might be that new hazards emerge after you've done that initial risk assessment. That you will need to lessen as well, such as surfaces that become flooded or slippery in poor weather, or building and maintenance taking place in and around your site, which could be dangerous for children. Now, as part of this, you should consider the safety and needs of all people within the setting, but especially adults and children with special educational needs or disabilities who use the site. For example, you may need to think about the specific needs when considering your evacuation route in the event of a fire. You should also consider how you manage these risks whilst ensuring children are still able to gain benefits from the tuition, training, instruction or activities. The Health and Safety Executive has written a statement on striking the balance in play and leisure, and it's on their website. It's a really, really good tool to look at. Now, in terms of the health and safety policy, this guidance tells us that you should have considered the health and safety and taken reasonable steps to reduce risks, regardless of the type of size of your setting. They suggest that this should include assessing the risk to any staff, volunteers and children, ensuring the facilities are adequate and appropriate for the activity, with access to sanitary facilities and drinking water. Should include a site risk assessment for the venue, surrounding areas and equipment. For example, if you're renting a community hall, the owners or voluntary management committee should check that they have complied with the health and safety law. Look at introducing measures to manage those risks and ensuring that adequate and appropriate arrangements and facilities for providing first aid are in place and the location of the first aid kit is clearly displayed. Leaders in these settings should tell employees about the risks and clearly designate and define measures to be taken to manage those risks. To ensure that relevant training is given to employers, leaders should give aside time and space to allow for that training to take place so that employers and volunteers are clear on their obligations with respect to health and safety. So let's turn to an example scenario. In this scenario, a self-employed dance teacher who teaches ballet to children aged 5 to 12 is moving a class to a new community hall. The owners of the community hall have already provided her with a health and safety checklist that they expect all hirers to adhere to. This includes information about the building's fire risk assessment with evacuation instructions in case of emergency, the location of the fire first aid box, the public liability insurance and so on. The dance teacher believes that because the owners of the hall have provided her with detailed information, she does not need to write her own health and safety policy. So let's think about what we could do in this scenario. So even though the owners of the hall have provided information to show that they are complying with health and safety law, the dance teachers should still carry out their own risk assessment specific to the activity for which she is hiring out the hall for, in this case, ballet. By carrying out a risk assessment, she may identify, for instance, that there's risk of a child slipping on the floor whilst dancing and injuring themselves. She will then need to introduce measures to manage those risks. For example, dance shoes should always be worn inside the hall and pupils should not wear any jewellery whilst dancing. As she does not employ any staff or volunteers, the dance teacher does not need to write down her health and safety policy. But she decides to record the steps she's taken to reduce risk and inform parents of the relevant actions, for example, proper footwear and no jewellery. Clear communication, a clear strategy to manage the risk is really important in this scenario. So let's turn now to another heading under the health and safety umbrella, which is around fire safety. Now, the guidance tells us that a fire safety management policy and evacuation plan must form part of your health and safety policy. The regulatory reform of the Fire Safety Order in 2005 details the legal duty to make sure that your premises and employees are kept safe from fire and can escape to safety if a fire occurs. Under that order, anyone who has control of the premise or over certain areas may be a reasonable person. This could be an employer, the owners of the premise, or the occupier, such as a self-employed person or voluntary organisation. If a number of people could be classed as the responsible person, you must work together to meet those requirements. The order applies to virtually all premises and covers nearly every type of building, structure and open space. This includes community halls, places of worship and other community premise such as schools and sports centre, tents and marquees, and the shared area of properties several households live in. The order does not apply to people's private homes, including individual flats in a block of house, unless you have paying guests, for example, if operating a bed and breakfast accommodation. However, it is good practice to have an evacuation plan if, for example, you're a private tutor working from your own home or another private residence. Specific guidance is available depending on the type of premises which you are hosting your activity or service. For example, if you're running a club in a community centre where there are more than 300 people could gather, you may wish to refer to Fire Safety Risk Assessment Large Places of Assembly, which is a guidance issued by the Health and Safety Executive. If you're running an outdoor sporting event, there's also guidance in that area as well, which tags on to that, which is specific for open air events and venues. So in terms of health and safety, what do settings need to ensure? Well, they must ensure they carry out a fire risk assessment. They must consider who may especially be at risk and reduce the risk from fire as much as reasonably possible and provide general fire precautions to deal with any possible risk that is left. They must take further measures to ensure that they make sure that there is protection if flammable or explosive materials are used or stored. Create an evacuation plan which is tailored and specific to the premise. And finally, they should record their risk assessment findings if they have more than 5 employees or volunteers. If your organisation is relatively small and you think potential risks are not complex, you could complete a fire risk assessment yourself. If your organisation is large and complex, or you do not feel able to do the fire risk assessment yourself, you can seek help, such as from a professional fire risk assessor. You must make sure your fire risk assessment is up to date. You'll need to re-examine it if you suspect it is no longer valid, say if the level of risk in your setting changes significantly, for example, a change in the number of people using your setting. So let's look at an example then. A self-employed music teacher offers piano lessons to children. Lessons typically take place in his home with one child at a time and their parents supervising the session. He has been tutoring children for 8 years and has never considered fire safety before, as he's giving the lesson in his own home. So, looking at this then and considering what we just spoke about, we know that fire safety law applies to most places except your own home, unless you have paying guests. This means that the music teacher does not need to carry out a fire risk assessment. However, he still has a duty of care to try to make sure that the children he is tutoring are safe. Children are a group that can be considered especially at risk when there is a fire. Therefore, he should take reasonable steps to reduce the risk and have a clear evacuation route. To reduce the risk, he might want to avoid burning candles whilst he's tutoring. To ensure a quick evacuation in the event of a fire, he should test his smoke alarms and identify escape routes, for example, through the kitchen to the back door, and make sure that routes are accessible. For example, keys should be beside the door so they can be quickly opened if the doors are locked. Turning to parental consent and attendance registers, we know that it is good practice to have parental consent forms when enrolling children in these types of settings. It's important so you've got relevant information for each child, such as parent, carer contact details, and whether that child has any particular needs, such as special educational needs, regular medicine, or allergies. When enrolling a child in your setting, consider the following points. Take note of more than one emergency contact per child, where reasonably possible, and ensure you are aware of any health conditions or medical requirements. You may also want to take note of the school that the child attends. To collect this information, you may want to create a consent form that parents and carers can complete. The NSPCC have a brilliant example template which we'll link below this episode in the resource bank. If you identify a child with any particular needs, it's really important that you discuss these with the parents and carers who will be able to guide you on how to address them. You should request updates for parent contact details, and you should do this once a year if a child attends the setting for more than a year. Before they enrol their child, you might consider encourage parents and carers to meet with you prior to or during a session so they are reassured that their child will be safe in your care. Visiting parents and carers should not be exempt from the child protection policy and procedures that your staff and volunteers follow. For example, you should never leave a child unsupervised with another parent or carer. Taking a register of attendance is also considered good practice, so you know how many and which children are present on a given day. So let's have a think now about what you would do if you discover a child is missing. Firstly, you should alert the designated safeguarding leader or senior staff member. The designated safeguarding leader or senior staff member should calmly search inside and outside of the building. If there is no sign of the child, you should contact the police immediately and also inform their parents. You should then wait for the police to arrive and follow their instructions. The designated safeguarding leader or senior member staff should continue to search whilst waiting for the police to arrive. If you discover that a child is missing under a loan provider or staff member who is looking for several children, you should not leave the other children unattended to search for the missing child. Instead, you should contact the missing child's parents and the police and stay with the other children until help arrives. Now turning to the legal and statutory requirements in this health and safety area. When considering health and safety in your settings, you must require with the legal requirements where they apply. For example, the Health and Safety Act, which is the primary piece of legislation covering workplace health and safety in Great Britain, captures a wide range of duties that employees must abide by and to ensure that their workplace is safe and those who work in a particular environment are not in danger both physically and mentally. And in there as well, there's a few other pieces of legislation such as the Regulatory Reform Fire Safety Order, the Occupiers Liability Act, the Employers Liability, the Food Safety Act, and of course the General Data Protection Regulations, GDPR. So finally, let's have a think about what kind of questions a parent might ask us about health and safety in one of these out-of-school settings and what advice we can give them. So that first one they may ask a provider is if they can have a copy of the health and safety policy. And the answer is yes, because you should always be able to provide or show parents a health and safety policy on request. Or if you have fewer than 5 members of staff or volunteers, you should at a minimum be able to explain to parents the reasonable steps you've taken to reduce the health and safety risks in your setting. A question may come about who is in charge of first aid. The answer is that regardless of whatever type of provision you offer, you should be able to name a designated person in charge of first aid and tell parents what first aid training this designated person has had. This designated person could be yourself or another person employed by or volunteering at the setting. You should also let parents know that you have a first aid kit available. Where you have multiple staff members, the location of the first aid kit should be clearly displayed in the setting. And finally, they may ask if you have a general kind of parental consent and emergency details form that you would need returning. And again, of course, the answer would be yes. You should collect more than one emergency contact where reasonably possible and the necessary medical information for each child. To collect this information, you might want to consider giving parents a physical or electronic consent form at the first session and asking for it back as soon as possible. If a child attends the setting for over a year, you should ask for this information to be updated each year. If more than one child attends your settings, it's good practice to create a register in case of an emergency such as a fire or in the event of one or more of your children in your care going missing. Any personal data you collect through consent forms or registered should be secured safely and securely and not retained for a longer period than is necessary. So let's turn now to safeguarding and child protection. So some basic requirements for out-of-school settings is to have a written child protection policy and written procedures in place that staff are aware of and of which address the specific safeguarding issues that can put children at risk of harm. Leaders in these scenarios should also undertake appropriate training to make sure staff have a clear understanding of their responsibilities in this area. Leaders should have appointed a suitably trained designated safeguarding lead, made staff aware and volunteers aware of what to do if they have concerns around a colleague who may pose risk of harm to children, and have ensured that all staff and volunteers know the referral routes into local authorities' children's social care. So we know that safeguarding child protection is everyone's responsibility. The DfE's statutory guidance working together to safeguard children, which applies to all organisations and agencies who have functions relating to children, sets out how they should work together to safeguard and promote the welfare of children. It is clear that anyone working with children should make their approach child-centred, i.e. give priority to the interests and needs of the child. So you should designate an adult, which could be yourself, to have that lead responsibility for safeguarding children while they're in your care. We call this person the Designated Safeguarding Lead, DSL. When appointing the DSL, you should consider the needs and characteristics of the children attending your setting. All staff, especially the DSL, should consider the context in which safeguarding incidents occur. For example, threats to children's welfare could arise in school or other educational establishments, from external visitors to the school or club, in peer groups, and from the wider online community. We advise staff and volunteers working with children to maintain an attitude of "it could happen here." When concerned about a child's welfare, they should always act in the child's best interest. They should know and understand the setting's safeguarding processes and the appropriate escalation route. These ideas should form the basis of your child protection policy. If schools, college or local authority premise are used for out-of-school setting purposes, the school or college must continue to have regard to keeping children safe in education when they rent out their facilities. The guidance is really clear that providers should check that the school or college has included safeguarding in their rental hire agreement or their memorandum of understanding if there's no formal contract. The provider must comply with any terms that the school or college sets to comply with keeping children safe in education. The guidance tells us that providers should have a clear and effective child protection policy in place that says how that provider will protect children in their care. The policy should be tailored to the organisation and will vary from one organisation to another, but regardless of the type and size of the setting, it should include at a minimum a short policy statement setting out the priority you're giving to keeping children and young people safe, and in broad terms how you would seek this. A commitment that under no circumstances should any staff or volunteer inflict physical or psychological harm on a child. Assault of a children is against the law. If an adult causes physical or psychological injury to or mistreats a child, they could be prosecuted for a criminal offence. A list of procedures that enables you to keep children in your care safe. If you are self-employed and do not have any staff members, you do not need to write down your procedures step by step. However, you should know what steps you would take if faced with a specific safeguarding issue. And finally, any additional guidance, information or expectations that you need families and anyone else linked to your organisation to be aware of. These should include details of your designated safeguarding lead and how to contact them, as well as contact details for local safeguarding services such as the local authority's children's social care, the local authority designated officer and the police. More information on the role of the DSL, local authorities children's social care and the ladder are explained in great detail in this guidance as you work through it. On this, it's worth noting that the NSPCC provides guidance on how to write user-friendly procedures which you might find helpful, and that is linked below this episode. In terms of safeguarding procedures, if you've got one or more employees or volunteers in your setting, then it's important to write down your procedures to ensure that all staff members understand their responsibilities and know what to do in the event of a safeguarding concern. Typically, these should include a procedure covering what to do if you've got a concern that a child may be at risk of abuse or exploitation, procedures to use in the event of an allegation or concerns of peer-on-peer abuse in your organisation, and a procedure to deal with allegations or concerns that an adult working in your setting with children or young people may present a risk of abuse. Now, we touch on this a little bit more in the governance settings, but it's important that settings have a complaints procedure that includes provision for children, young people and families to raise a safeguarding concern. If you have employees or volunteers, you should also consider additional guidance, information or expectations that you need them to be aware of, and these can include a code of conduct, information about the different types of abuse, the signs and symptoms, and how to respond directly to a child who discloses abuse. And finally, the guidance for safeguarding in this area tells us or reminds us that any concern about a child should be acted on immediately. And it tells us that this would typically involve speaking to the DSL, who would record the concern and consider making a referral into the local authority's children's social care team. Now, if a child's suffering or is likely to suffer immediate harm, it is important that you make a referral to children's social care and, if appropriate, the police at once. If you are the DSL, you should talk to your local authority's children's social care team if you have any concerns, and referrals should follow the local authority's referral process. Knowing what to look for is vital to the early identification of abuse and neglect. If staff and volunteers are unsure, they should always speak to the DSL. The DSL will consider the most appropriate course of action and make referrals to the appropriate agencies as required. If a staff member believes after such consideration a child may still be at risk of harm, they should speak again to the DSL. If they're still not satisfied, they should consider making their own referral into local authority's children's social care or the local authority designated officer, the LADO. The guidance touches on peer-on-peer abuse. It tells us that staff and volunteers should read this section of guidance and be aware that peer-on-peer abuse, often referred to as child-on-child abuse, is a safeguarding issue, and such abuse is most likely to include, but is not limited to, abuse in intimate personal relationships between peers, bullying, including cyberbullying, physical abuse, sexual abuse, sexting, intimidation, and criminal and sexual exploitation. And staff and volunteers should be clear about the settings, policy and procedures on peer-on-peer abuse as described under the subheading Safeguarding and Child Protection Policy back earlier in this document. So let's have a look then at a few example scenarios to help, which are put in there to help settings understand their obligations in this area. So the first one is an example scenario where two volunteers at a local art group for children notice a father shouting at his 8-year-old daughter when he comes to collect her. He's shouting in another language and they aren't really sure what's being said. The volunteers have heard other parents worrying about the child, saying the father's often nasty. They're concerned this may be emotional abuse, but they don't want to report it in case they are misunderstood due to the language barrier. They wonder if they should wait and see if the girl says anything to them about her father's behaviour. Now, our advice here would be really clear that we should never wait until a child or young person tells you directly that they're experiencing abuse before taking action. You should also not let concerns about cultural sensitivity stand in the way of safeguarding and protecting children and young people. The two volunteers should report their concerns immediately to the DSL, who will then consider appropriate next steps, which may include a referral to the local authority's children's social care team. Now, in this next example, we turn to peer-on-peer abuse, and in this example, a self-employed coach of a community football club noticed that a 15-year-old is unhappy and asks them what happened. The boy tells his coach that he sent an explicit photo of himself to his 16-year-old boyfriend. He says he didn't feel pressured into sending the photo, but then his boyfriend has shared it with their friends, which he didn't consent to. He's now been bullied about it by his friends and other children who attend the football club and who have seen the image. Now, in terms of advice, even when incidents happen outside your organisation, you're responsible for taking action to protect children and young people involved. If you are concerned for a child or young person in your group, report it to your DSL. In this example, the coach is the DSL as he is a loan provider. As the DSL, the coach should seek advice from local authorities' children's social care. Parents should be informed at an early stage and involved in the process unless there is a good reason to believe that doing so would put the child at risk of harm. Victims should always be taken seriously, reassured and supported and kept safe. The coach should not promise confidentiality at the initial stage, but should only share the report with those necessary for its progression. If the child is suffering or likely to suffer harm, it is important that a referral to the local authority's children's social care, and if appropriate, the police, is made immediately. So let's never forget that any setting, and in some areas, out of school settings are at an increased risk for concerns in this area, and that is where we look to protect children from extremism and radicalisation. So in this scenario, a private tutor teaches 3 children for an hour a week at the house of one of their parents. Among them is a 14-year-old boy who has become increasingly argumentative when discussing World War II. He has told the tutor that he thinks people who are not white are not really British. He says people from ethnic minority backgrounds are taking over, and for this reason only white people should be able to vote in elections. He won't listen to different points of views, and has made comments towards another student who he was previously friendly with that are abusist and racist. When the tutor talks to the boy about his changed behaviour, he tells her that he has been speaking to someone online who has been encouraging these views. He no longer speaks with his old friends because they don't share his opinions, but his online acquaintances encourage him to meet in person so he can introduce him to others and share these views. Now, the boy's changed behaviour may mean that he's been radicalised by the person he's met online. The private tutor should try to talk to the boy's parents to find out if they are aware of the situation. She should then contact her local authority's prevent lead or the designated officer, so they can advise her further on what support is available. She can find these details on a local authority's website by searching for Prevent or Child Safeguarding. Now, appointing a designated safeguarding lead. This document also places a new expectation on out-of-school settings to appoint a designated safeguarding lead. Information on appointing a designated safeguarding lead is included back towards the beginning of the document, where it tells about some of the expectations around who should undertake that role. DSL should be suitably trained and have a good understanding of specific safeguarding issues, including bullying, physical abuse, sexual harassment, sexual violence, sexting, hazing, online safety, substance misuse, extremism, and radicalisation. Child protection and what abuse can look like, referral processes into the local authority's social care team, and what to expect when a referral is made to children's social care. Because it is important that staff and volunteers, but especially the designated safeguarding lead, are aware of the local referral into children's social care. Local authorities work with partner organisations and agencies that have specific duties to safeguard and promote the welfare of children in their area. The local authority, chief officer of the police, and chief executive of the clinical commissioning group have a shared and equal duty to make arrangements to work together to safeguard and promote the welfare of all children in their area. This involves working with named relevant agencies, which could include out-of-school settings providers. All local areas published online their new multi-agency safeguarding arrangements in June 2019 and implemented them by the end of September 2019. And you should familiarise yourself with those local arrangements and contact the partnership should you need any more information. Now, this final area around managing concerns is directed more towards the leaders of such organisations. There's detailed information on a DSL's duties, and relevant training can be found in Annex B of the latest Keeping Children Safe in Education guidance. Now, although keeping children safe is intended for schools and colleges, it is useful for out-of-school setting providers. DSLs can contact their local authorities for information on training in that area and speak specifically to the LADO, the local authority's designated officer, who again would be able to support their work on that. The DSL should record any concerns regarding abuse and neglect, what they have done about them, and the reasons for their decisions. There's some templates down here in the resource bank that you're welcome to share with any local settings that our children are attending and their parents are engaging with us about. So what should staff know? Well, staff and volunteers should be aware that they must raise all safeguarding concerns with the DSL immediately. The DSL should act as a source of support, advice and expertise to staff and volunteers on matters of safeguarding. But it is important that all staff and volunteers know the appropriate safeguarding policies they should follow. The DSL should also know the contact information of their local authority designated officer, LADO, who may simply be known as the designated officer. The role of the LADO is to coordinate all allegations and concerns made against a person who works with children. The LADO will advise in discussion with the senior manager within the organisation on what action should be taken by the provider and whether the matter should be referred to children's social care. Being clear about your expectations of the behaviour of staff is an important part of safeguarding the children in your care. A staff behaviour policy sets out the standards of behaviour for all your staff, including volunteers, that they should follow. It should include clear expectations of what people should do and say and what they must not. This will help raise awareness of illegal, unsafe, unprofessional and unwise behaviour. Providers should ensure that they have procedures in place, including clear escalation routes, to manage concerns and allegations against staff and volunteers that might indicate they pose a risk of harm to children. And such allegations should be referred to the designated safeguarding lead or another agreed senior person who can then escalate that concern to the local authority's designated officer. A slight difference to in school, where in school we would put that concern straight through to the head teacher. Working together to safeguard children gives more guidance on dealing with allegations against people in position of trusts. If your setting is a charity, you're required to report serious incidents, including incidents of abuse or mistreatment, alleged or actual, of beneficiaries of the charity, which have resulted in a risk of significant harm to them. In your setting, if a child discloses to you that they've been abused or they feel at risk of harm, you should follow your safeguarding policies and procedures immediately. These should include clear instructions on the local referral route into children's social care, as described at the subheading Local Authorities, Children's Social Care and Multi-Age Safeguarding Arrangements. It's kind of what we talked about 20 minutes ago when we were talking about the initial key responsibilities in the area of safeguarding and child protection. So some questions that a parent might ask you, and that first one is, who is responsible for safeguarding child protection and what training have they had? You should be able to provide a name of the person who's responsible for safeguarding your DSL. It's okay if you're a lone provider that person may be yourself. The DSL should have had the training that gives them the knowledge and skills needed for the role. At a minimum, the DSL should be aware of safeguarding issues children may face in settings and have the contact for the local authority's social care team. There is no requirement for how often training is repeated, but the DSL may want to conduct a regular review of the training they've undertaken and consider whether there are new legislative requirements or if the circumstances of the provision have changed. This might mean that they need to repeat or seek extra training. The DSL may want to consider conducting this review once a year, for example. Another question might be, will anyone besides the instructor of my children be present in the setting whilst my child is there? If so, will they be regularly? As a rule, you should not have people who are not part of your organisation at your setting whilst children are present. If other people will be present besides the instructor of the children's parents, you should have a visitors book where they can sign in and ask them to show you ID. You should ensure that any adult who is not a member of staff is never alone with a child in your care. Another question they may ask to see your child protection policy and procedures, and that's absolutely fine. If you run a provision for children and engage one or more volunteers or paid employees, you should be able to give a physical or electronic copy of your setting's child protection policy to a parent on request. You should make sure it includes a short policy statement setting out the priority you give to keeping children safe, a commitment that no member of staff will ever inflict corporal or emotional punishment, and a list of procedures that will enable you to be able to ensure that your staff achieve the measures you refer to in your policy. If you're a volunteer or loan provider, you should still have a written child protection policy that you can give to parents on request. You don't need to have any written safeguarding procedures, but you should be able to offer reassurance to a parent that you're aware of specific safeguarding issues. Another question, is my child allowed unsupervised access to the internet? Children should be 13 or older to access the internet unsupervised. Your setting should not allow children under 13 to do so. If children can access the internet unsupervised, you should have filtering and monitoring systems in place, as outlined in the online safety policy in the other requirements section. That's right at the end of the policy. How do you securely store information you hold about a child and who has access to it? Now, we know from understanding GDPR and understanding our safeguarding obligations in this area that if you keep any information on a child who attends your setting, such as a register, you should be able to detail how you store paper and electronic copies of the files. If you store electronic data, it should be encrypted and password protected. If you store paper data, it should be secured with a lock and ideally in a private office. The DSL or someone senior enough in the organisation to trust it with should have access. This information should not be given to other parties without the child's consent. How do you talk to children about online safety? Well, you should be able to show you have a good general understanding of the different risks that people face online, such as adults posing as children on anonymous chat rooms. You should be able to show you have a positive, supportive conversations about online safety with children. A really key area for out-of-school clubs and wraparound care is getting that right around e-safety. Working closely with your school will ensure there's a consistent message that goes out to young people and children about using the internet safely. Now, the next stage of this document talks around the suitability of staff and volunteers to work in a setting. Now, remember, it's not to rely on any single check, for example, a DBS, when deciding on the suitability of staff. It's important to continue reviewing the performance, skills and training of your staff after employment and to ensure that they are aware of the safeguarding policies and procedures as described throughout this guidance. This is to ensure that you've taken appropriate steps during the recruitment of new staff and volunteers to ensure that they are suitable and have determined whether your setting makes them a regulated activity provider, and if so, have you undertaken the appropriate checks on staff and volunteers, for example, DBS, Bardley's checks, etc. Regularly reviewing the performance and suitability of staff and volunteers after appointment is a critical part of safer recruitment. So let's turn to an example then. In this example, a football coach runs training sessions for children aged 7 to 15 3 times a week alongside a volunteer assistant coach who helps her to supervise the children. The volunteer assistant coach is moving to another area in the next few weeks, and so the football coach will need to find a new assistant to help her supervise the children. One of the children's parents has mentioned the opportunity to a brother-in-law who is keen to do more voluntary work within the local community. The football coach has never met him, but he comes well recommended by the child's parent for the assistant coach position. Now, robust recruitment practices are an important part of keeping children safe. The football coach should not rely on a recommendation from one of the children's parents. They should advertise the assistant coach position in the local newspaper or relevant websites and recommend that they apply through the proper channels. The football coach should undertake the appropriate pre-employment checks on any applicants, such as ID checks, and invite the shortlisted applicants to an interview where she can ask them for details about relevant experience that would make them suitable for the role. She should ask the successful candidate to provide her with references from previous voluntary experience or employment and check these references to make sure they answer all appropriate questions satisfactorily. As the assistant coach will be helping with the training sessions 3 times a week, this would be considered regulated activity, so the football coach should ensure that the volunteer is DBS checked, and in addition, there has been a children's Bardley's check conducted as well. Robust recruitment practices are an important part of keeping children safe in education. In terms of regulated activity and asking yourself the question as to whether or not you are a regulated activity provider, it's important to determine whether you are or not. If you undertake regulated activity, you have extra safeguarding responsibilities, specifically with regard to DBS checks. Regulated activity is defined at Schedule 4 of the Safeguarding Vulnerable Groups Act of 2006, as amended by Part 5 of the Protection of Freedoms Act 2012. Regulated activity regarding children comprises, in summary, of unsupervised activities where someone is teaching, training, instructing, caring for, or supervising children, or providing advice, guidance on well-being, or driving a vehicle only for children. Working in a limited range of establishments called specified places, with opportunities for contact, for example, schools, children's home, childcare premises, but this does not include work by supervised volunteers. Relevant personal care, for example, the washing or dressing or healthcare by supervised, professional and registered childminding and foster carers. Work under the first 2 points is regulated activity only if done regularly, and regularly is defined as an activity by the same person frequently or on 3 or more days in a 30-day period, or overnight at any time between 2 a.m. and 6 a.m. Therefore, a ballet teacher training a class of children for 2 evenings a week would be regulated activity. Equally, an unsupervised volunteer supervising children at a tuition centre on the weekends would also be in regulated activity. It's worth remembering that the DBS has the power to bar an individual from working in regulated activity with children or vulnerable adults. Those in regulated activity are eligible for an enhanced certificate with a check of the relevant barred lists. Individuals can be barred if they are convicted or cautioned for a relevant offence such as sexual or violent offences, or if they're referred to by their employee who is concerned that individual poses a risk of harm to children or vulnerable adults. Organisations that engage people in regulated activity have a legal duty to make a referral to the DBS when they have dismissed or removed a member of staff from working in regulated activity after harm to a child or vulnerable adult from where there is a risk of harm. The question comes around having staff and volunteers and whether or not they've undergone the DBS checks. Getting a DBS check is an important part of certain professions' recruitment and safeguarding policies and practice. However, if a provider is also a regulated provider, it is especially important that all staff and volunteers are DBS checked. This is because, frankly, providers will be breaking the law if you knowingly recruit someone to work in a regulated activity who has been barred from working with children. And this applies to staff and volunteers that are unsupervised workers. The DBS provides criminal record certificates for people undertaking or applying for roles or occupations that are eligible for a check. Criminal record checks help the employee to determine the suitability of an individual for a particular role, especially when working with children, and should be considered alongside other information such as references. There are 4 types of DBS check, and we know this: basic, standard, enhanced and enhanced with barred list. These checks will disclose unspent and for certain roles some spent convictions and cautions, subject to the rules set out in law. A DBS check can only give information about records held in the UK. A basic DBS check can be obtained for any purpose. Roles are eligible for standard and enhanced checks only if they meet the certain criteria. You can apply for a basic DBS check yourself. If the role is eligible for a standard or enhanced check, it must be done on your behalf through a registered DBS umbrella body. You may be able to get a DBS check through your local authority. A self-employed person may be eligible for a standard or enhanced DBS check if they're working for an organisation such as a school or a local authority. In that case, the organisation that wishes to contract their services can apply for the check. And it's worth noting in this area as well around childcare disqualification. For staff who work in childcare or who are directly involved with its management, employees need to ensure that appropriate checks are done so they can make sure that individuals have not been disqualified under the childcare disqualification and childcare early years provision free of charge regulations 2018. For more about the staff who those regulations apply, the checks and the recording of those checks, you'll need to have a look at the disqualification of the Childcare Act statutory guidance. So, what regulated activity providers should do where concerns are raised about staff or volunteers who may pose a risk of harm to children? If the activity in your setting means you are a regulated activity provider, you should request a DBS check for your staff members and volunteers and a barred list check. You will also be subject to obligation of the Safeguarding Vulnerable Groups Act 2016, which means you have a legal duty to refer an individual to the DBS where relevant. You have to withdraw permission for a person to engage in regulated activity with children or move them to an area of work that isn't regulated activity. You think at least one of the following statements apply to the person: their action or inaction has harmed a child or put them at risk of harm. They have satisfied the harm test regarding children or vulnerable adults. For example, there has been no relevant conduct, but a risk of harm to a child still exists. They have been cautioned or convicted of a relevant offence. The legal duty on a regulated provider to make a referral still applies if these conditions have been met and the individual has been redeployed, for example, to another location, has resigned, retired, or left the organisation. And you can make that referral to the DBS using the online form on their website, and a reminder that this is a legal duty and failure to refer when the criteria is met is a criminal offence. So let's turn now to after appointment. The guidance is really clear that once appointed, you should regularly monitor and review the individuals in post to ensure that they continue to be well suited and have the necessary skills and training to carry out their role and responsibilities. This should include ensuring staff have appropriate training on health and safety and child protection as set out in sections 1 and 2. This review could be conducted once a year, for example, or if the circumstances of your provision change, for example, a child with special educational needs or disabilities joins your settings. And then finally, as with the other section, there's a range of legal requirements and statutory guidance that you need to give due diligence to. And when considering the suitability of staff and volunteers in your setting, you must comply with the following legal requirements if they apply. The Childcare Disqualification Act. The 2018 regulations are made under the Children's Act of 2006, the Immigration, Asylum and Nationality Act of 2006, the Safeguarding Vulnerable Groups Act of 2006. And also, if you're working with schools or in a hired school hall, it's important that you give attention to Keeping Children Safe in Education 2020. So, as we have with them all, let's turn to an example scenario now. The example scenario is that the designated safeguarding lead of a tuition centre is told by a volunteer that he witnessed another staff member slapping a child. It allegedly happened during a class, but the volunteer believes that he is the only adult to have witnessed the incident. The volunteer has only been in this role for a few weeks, whereas the member of staff he is making his accusation against has been in the role for 2 years, and the DSL has never received any complaints about his conduct before. Now, we know the DSL should take the concerns seriously, regardless of who the person is or how long they've been involved with the organisation. The DSL follows the tuition's centre's safeguarding procedures, which have been written down and distributed to all staff members. Following these procedures and based on the training they've received, the DSL should know now that they must not attempt to investigate the allegation. For example, they should not interview the child concerned, but should keep written records of the allegations made and any other relevant information that comes to light. The DSL must report the allegation immediately to Child Protection Services, the local authority's designated officer, or the police. The DSL should call the parents of the child and explain that a concern has been raised and give them details on how they're going to manage the allegation. The DSL should also explain to all parties involved that confidentiality is important while the concern is being investigated, but that they will be kept informed about the progress and outcomes of the case. If the tuition centre removes the staff member from working with children, the DSL must also inform the DBS, and failure to do this would be a criminal offence. So let's have a look at some questions that parents may ask providers or may ask us around what they should expect from providers. So that first one is that. What checks do you undertake to ensure staff are suitable to work with children? How recent were they? Well, regardless of the type and size of your setting, you should safeguard and promote children's welfare by making sure you have robust procedures in place to prevent unsuitable people from working or volunteering in your setting. You should be able to describe to parents a range of checks that you've undertaken on staff members to reassure them that your child is safe in your care. It is important that you do not rely on one single check, for example, the DBS check, to determine whether staff or volunteers are suitable. Parents may decide to send their children to another setting if your child has have not undergone appropriate checks. Checks should not be relied on indefinitely, and you should be able to explain to parents how staff members are evaluated post-appointment to ensure that they are able to fulfil their roles and responsibilities as to how checks are carried out again where appropriate, for instance, DBS checks. So what training have staff and volunteers had? Well, training will differ according to the type of setting, but all staff and volunteers should have at least a good working knowledge of and be appropriately trained in health and safety and safeguarding and child protection. You should be able to verbally detail the training that staff and volunteers have done and ideally have physical proof of the training has been undertaken, for example copies of the certificates. Question: you're providing a tutor to help my child. How can I be sure they aren't prohibited from teaching? Details of any unqualified teacher who is subject to a prohibition order are published on gov.uk. A prohibition order prevents an individual from teaching in any school, sixth form college, children's home or youth accommodation in England. When considering whether a person is suitable to teach their children in an out-of-school setting, parents may wish to check the person isn't prohibited. Any member of the public can inspect the full list of teachers who are banned, which is held by the Teaching Regulation Agency, TRA. To do this, they can contact the TRA directly. Providers can also carry out Section 128 prohibition checks. Individuals with a Section 128 are prohibited from running an independent school. A prohibition order, however, does not prevent someone from teaching in an out-of-school setting. But when deciding whether to leave their children in the care of a prohibited teacher, parents may wish to consider the circumstances that led to the prohibition. And finally then, we turn to governance. Governance refers to the way the organisation is run and the rules, practices and processes that they have in place to control this. Good governance is important to ensure there is a clear process in place for decision making on all aspects of these settings' operations. Your approach to governance will depend on several factors. For example, a setting that is a charity or that operates within a charity must comply with charity law. Now remember, the practice and policies that you put in place, such as your complaints procedure, should be reviewed regularly to ensure that they work effectively. And this is to ensure that you have registered your setting as a charity, set up with a HMRC if appropriate, set up a management committee, have a clear and effective complaints policy, and a clear and effective whistleblowing policy. Now, things differ slightly for charities. Most charities in England and Wales are registered with and regulated by the Charity Commission and must comply with a number of rules and regulations, including legal requirements and regulatory expectations on the safeguarding of children and others who may be at risk of harm. So, having charitable status may increase public confidence and reassure parents and carers that providers are regulated and accountable. Further guidance on safeguarding in charities is available from the Charity Commission. However, for all other providers, if your setting has multiple employees or volunteers and is not a charity, it is still good practice to set up a management committee to ensure that it is effective in its running and its day-to-day management. This group could be referred to by a different name, such as the Executive Committee or Steering Group. If you run a setting with one or more volunteers or paid employees, you make a profit, then you must register with the HMRC. And you can find more information around that on the HMRC website. So turning to the complaints policy then, sometimes a parent or staff member may be alerted to an issue by their child or another parent regarding an out-of-school setting. As a provider, you should have a clear policy to deal effectively with complaints. You should publish a complaints policy and procedure on your website or display it in your settings so that people know how to raise a concern. This should include how to make a complaint, whether in person or in writing, who to complain to, and how it will be dealt with. And establish a whistleblowing policy so staff can raise concerns about how the setting is run, other members of staff, the maltreatment of any children, and other bad practice. Turning to the whistleblowing policy, all staff and volunteers should feel able to raise concerns about poor or unsafe practice and potential failures in the provider's safeguarding regime and know that such concerns will be taken seriously by its senior leadership team. Appropriate whistleblowing procedures, which are suitably reflected in staff training and staff behaviour policies, should be in place so that concerns can be raised with the provider's senior leadership team. If a staff member feels unable to raise an issue with their employee or feels their genuine concerns are not being addressed, they should turn to the government's guidance on alternative routes for whistleblowing. Personal grievances such as bullying, harassment and discrimination are not covered by UK whistleblowing law unless a particular case is in the public interest. Staff may not be legally protected against unfair treatment or a loss of income as a result of blowing the whistle if they are not a paid employee of the organisation in question. However, it is good practice, but not a legal duty, for all settings to have a formal and clear whistleblowing policy. Volunteers who may not be protected under whistleblowing law may wish to read the government guidance or seek independent advice from organisations such as Citizens Advice or ACAS before taking actions. And of course, it's worth noting that you can always call or refer a parent or a provider to the NSPCC's whistleblowing advice line for free support and advice around whistleblowing on child protection concerns. Now, this guidance document concludes with a few pages with some just general tips and tricks and reminding providers around their obligations under certain pieces of legislation. In particular, it gives staff some extra advice around children with special educational needs, an online safety policy, staff behaviour policies. It advises providers and parents around the use of photography and sharing images and the limitations around that. And then the document concludes with a range of little pointers of tips around things like bringing in external speakers, going on overnight stays, and the associated legislation that sits alongside that. This document is best placed to help parents decide on a safe setting for their child to attend. Whilst it's not a statutory document or one that impacts us in education directly, knowing and understanding its impact will help us guide parents and understand how safe children are in school, but also outside of school at wraparound care, out of school clubs, external tuition centres and general community centres. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Safeguarding Days. The full guidance can be found on our website at www.safeguardingdays.co.uk.